Hello, welcome to STAT's virtual event, Increasing Diversity in Clinical Trials, sponsored by PRA Health Sciences. Thank you for joining us. I'm Nicholas St. Fleur. I'm a Knight Wallace Reporting Fellow here at STAT. And before we get started, a few quick housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the STAT team, which appears as STAT Events. Please do not put your questions for us in the chat. If you do have a question that you would like us to ask, please use the Q&A feature to type your question and we will try to answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the questions you would most like to see answered. We will be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end to submit. This is part of what makes these events unique. Thanks again to you all for being here. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Kent Tolke, Chief Scientific Officer and Executive Vice President at PRA Health Sciences, for a sponsored introduction of today's event. Take it away, Kent.
Thank you, Nicholas. Yes, so I'm Kent Tolke. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer and Executive Vice President at PRA Health Sciences. I'm thrilled to be able to have PRA sponsor this STAT virtual event on diversity in clinical trials. So I don't think diversity in clinical trials is a new topic. We've been talking about the need for diversity and equity in clinical trials for a number of years. I think what changed is much of the conversation has been just that. For many years, policies put out by FDA and NIH, policies put out by industry groups like pharma around the importance of expanding diversity in clinical trials to better match kind of the overall patient populations. What happened then was a number of years of talking about it suddenly changed into reality when COVID hit. And so what we saw with COVID was a stark reminder to everybody around the inequity in healthcare delivery amongst minority populations, different cultural or race populations, gender issues. And so this only highlighted the need for making sure that clinical trials actually match the patient populations that we were trying to treat. And I think that, for many of us, the conversations around DE&I and equity and inclusion is really around kind of the concept of why it's important to have diverse populations. But more importantly, and for pharma and for those in drug development and clinical trials, this is really about good science as well. So beyond kind of the moral imperative of ensuring equity amongst healthcare and access to clinical trials, the concept of good science is critical. And so what we know is, relative to drug development, mechanisms of action can vary in different populations. They can vary by gender, they can vary by race, background. And so, and we have seen that time and again in drugs that either fail because they were tested in the wrong populations, or we test drugs and get them approved in a minority, Caucasian or white population when the target population is actually different. And so from a scientific perspective, there is a paramount need to ensure that the populations we're treating in clinical trials match the populations that will be using the drug, and that we understand if there's a difference in safety or efficacy by mechanism of action that may be related to different racial or ethnic backgrounds. And so that's all critical. I think that when we talk about the value of diversity and equity in clinical trials, the other thing that became very apparent to us with COVID is that we had set up a system that by its very nature excluded different patient populations. And those have been by socioeconomic status, by race, et cetera. And so all of a sudden, we have to reimagine the entire paradigm that our drug development industry has created, which is, for the most part, for the last 20 or 30 years, we have gone to primarily all the same clinical centers to run these clinical trials. And they tend to be academic medical centers. They tend to be tertiary medical centers where the populations are rather homogeneous. The populations and catchment areas for those hospitals tend to be low when it comes to minority percentages or underrepresented patient populations. And so really this is around kind of the initial steps of breaking that mold and really taking clinical trials to where these patient populations exist, where diverse and underrepresented patients actually exist and get their healthcare delivered, and ensuring that we are creating a clinical research access point for those patients to have access to clinical trials as well. And so there's some of this is around process, some of this is around kind of breaking down those traditional models, some of this is around reimagining where we get patients. The other thing that we have seen over the last probably 12 months relative to COVID is an increase in the use of decentralizing clinical trials, utilizing mobile health and mobile technology to lower the barrier and increase access to larger numbers of patients where social determinants of health may limit their ability to participate in research. And so there's all of these kind of multifunctional approaches right now to ensure that we are lowering barriers to entry, to participation in clinical trials, and increasing access. And when we do that and we create representative populations in our clinical trials, we create better science, we create safer drugs, we create better understanding and profiles around the efficacy of the drugs we're testing. And so this conversation is an incredibly important conversation. It encompasses all of those areas. It encompasses good science. It encompasses the issues around health equity and access to healthcare in general, and then how clinical research as a care option for all patients becomes important, so that we are including Black Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, Hispanic Americans, even things like gender and sexual identity, LGBTQ populations. It's important that we look at all of these populations as we develop drugs and create comprehensive safety and efficacy profiles. And with that, I'd like to turn this back over to Nicholas. I think this panel is phenomenal. There's a tremendous number of intelligent people here to really expand upon these conversations, and I'm looking forward to hearing how it goes. Nicholas?
Hey, thank you for that, Kent. We appreciate it. So joining me now for the remainder of today's event, I'd like to welcome our panelists who bring some different perspectives on this important issue. We have Quita Beeler Highsmith. She is Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Genentech. We have Dr. Jonathan Jackson, Assistant Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School and Director of the CARE Research Center at Massachusetts General Hospital. We have Dr. Clyde W. Yancey, Vice Dean of Diversity and Inclusion, Professor of Medicine, Professor of Medical Social Sciences, and Chief of the Division of Cardiology at the Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. Thanks to you all for taking the time to be a part of our important discussion today. To kick us off, I will start off with Jonathan. I have a question for you. In your views, why is diversity in clinical trials such an important issue?
Wow. So first of all, Nick and Stat, thank you so much for having me. But why is it a critical issue? I think it's several critical issues. I think it's the thread that you pull to realize that there are fundamental problems with our science. But I think vitally what we are realizing and what we've seen again and again and again, most recently when we were all very worried about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is that there is this fundamental truth that the medicines that we develop should work for everyone, but they don't. And in order to be sure about that, and in order to make sure that we are more confident about the vaccines and the treatments and the therapies and the biologics and the devices that we develop, we need to get this right during the clinical trials, not when a drug is out in the wild and people are paying for that risk. So it's important because it means something to everybody. And if you are not white, if you are not wealthy, if you are not male, if you are not living on the east or west coast of the United States, in an urban or a suburban center, you are underrepresented in trials. We're going to talk a lot about race and ethnic minorities. We're going to talk about gender minorities, but the odds are really good that every single person who's tuning into this is underrepresented in clinical research, which means we don't know if the drugs that we're developing work for us until we're paying for them and taking them ourselves. We can do better. And, we're scientists, so let's science this.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. And Quita, I'd love to ask you the same question. Why is it that diversity in clinical trials is important from your perspective?
When you think about diversity in clinical trials, one of the things that is really, as we think about the future is that we're going to be using genomic information to make treatment decisions, and algorithms are going to be using that data. Right now, today, 91% of the genomic materials available to scientists are of European ancestry. over 33 pharma companies are using artificial intelligence for drug discovery and in partnerships and collaborations. And so for me, as a Black woman who could potentially get triple negative breast cancer, just the thought that the data that they're going to be using for the treatment algorithm for me is basically going to be based on a white woman. And so how do I know that the treatment algorithm, that the drug that is available is going to be safe and effective for me in my treatment? And so it is critically important that we begin to expand who gets to participate, who is asked to participate, and so that we can ensure that our future generations have the same opportunities for safety and efficacy as others have had in the past.
Thank you so much for your input there. And Clyde, I would love to ask you as well, why is this such an important, uh, topic issue to discuss, especially nowadays from your perspective?
So Nick, let me back up and say this is an incredibly important discussion.
Mhm.
First, I want to thank Kent Folke. I mean, we always need somebody who wants to step up and host these conversations. They're not expensive, they're time sensitive, they're time dependent. And for someone to have the clarity of vision to say, we need to host these conversations, I want to express my gratitude. I also want to express my gratitude to Stat. You've got an amazing legacy of being right at that intersection between policy and science and really helping us understand how we should think about the things that we know and what we should do differently. I've enjoyed contributing to Stat, and this is another very useful function. Now, let's think about what we've just heard. Dr. Jackson articulated something that was absolutely brilliant. We default quickly to thinking that this conversation is about Black and Brown individuals. That's not correct. There are people in rural environments that are underrepresented. There are non-English speaking people that are underrepresented. There are people with poor health literacy that are underrepresented. There are older people that are underrepresented. And yes, Black and Brown people are consistently underrepresented, as are children and adolescents. And so the cause that we're advocating is really not planting a race or ethnicity flag. It's saying that time out. We need to completely pivot and rethink the broad landscape of how we approach trials. And the other important contribution from Dr. Jackson was this is a science problem. This isn't a political problem. Let's use science to answer this question. And as Quita Highsmith brilliantly articulates, we have exciting new tools that will make this not as challenging as it was before. Specifically, we can use genomics to better identify patients at risk. We can use information technologies to better communicate risk and benefits. We can use IT-based informed consent to really take that human element out of the equation. We can use crowdsourcing to identify candidates for trials. There are ways that we can use contemporary technologies and science to more quickly, more appropriately, and in a much more representative way answer questions. The question you pose, why is this conversation necessary? This conversation is critical, Nick. It's not necessary, it's critical. We're at a time where everything in health and society is undergoing a fundamental pivot, a pivot we hope towards equity. And again, as Dr. Jackson pointed out, equity for all cohorts. This is the time to pause and rethink exactly how we do things. We should not fear the disruptive moment. That's what we need in clinical trials. We need to come up with a way to get more information relevant for more patients more quickly, more efficiently, and with more intelligence. That's the thing we need to do. We can't do just more of the same. We have to do it differently and be smart about it.
Clyde, thank you so much, and especially for your kind words there as well. A question that comes up when we talk about, diversity in clinical trials, or what are the barriers here? What is keeping us from, increasing diversity or reaching adequate levels of diversity? Jonathan, I'd love to kind of pose this question to you to begin with. What are these barriers, and what are your thoughts or recommendations on how to overcome them?
Yeah, so this is a rich topic, and there's actually plenty for Quita and Clyde to dig into. So I'm going to keep my answer real narrow. So as somebody coming at this from the scientific perspective, you can do a lit review. It doesn't really matter what disease or disorder or area or place on the globe that you're studying. There are basically 10 reasons why it's hard to get people involved in clinical research with any kind of representativeness. And I think part of the problem is, number one, there is no real data ontology. There's no comparative effectiveness. There are no real data standards, period, for getting this right. You know, we hear about famous studies that have some kind of diversity. People really tout it, but we don't have clear understanding of why that is. And so when people write papers about it, as we should, and when we try to communicate about it, we don't necessarily do that with the same kind of clarity that we do with other parts of our research protocol. So, you know, as Clyde was saying, this is a scientific problem, but we're not necessarily being scientific in our approach to it. We're sort of hoping that the plural of anecdote is data, and it's just not true here, as it's not true anywhere else. So in terms of solutions, we have to understand where the problem is. But if I could just refer to the other sort of kick in the pants that we got, it wasn't just COVID, it was the murder of George Floyd that reached us in the scientific field too, and realized, hang on, the same kinds of problems that we're seeing with policing, the same kind of problems we're seeing with housing, they're present in our clinical research too. So we do have to rethink all of these issues from a more systemic framework, and systemic problems need systemic solutions. So, you know, historically, we leave the burden to solving the diversity problem on potential research participants. Nowadays, there's a bit of a shift, and we're putting that burden on individual research teams. That's not going to work either. We need to build an infrastructure that's full of carrots and sticks in order to get this right. But it's not going to happen if we leave teams under-resourced, unequipped, with no data practices or ontology or frameworks, and without any real incentive to get this right, other than the fact that a major funder is breathing down their neck.
So let's keep this conversation going, because it really is about what are the barriers. That's how you set the question up, Nick. And I really appreciate Dr. Jackson articulating that there are at least 10 barriers, maybe more. But let's really reduce that to what I think are the fundamental barriers. Why do we do clinical trials? We do clinical trials because there is a sponsor that has an opportunity to advance a new proprietary device or compound for capital return. Or there's an academic imperative driven by extramural funding to answer a necessary scientific hypothesis for the greater good of health. What that means is that we have to immerse ourselves in the culture of that initial decision-making to make certain that initial decision-making starts from a premise of being inclusive. I mean, what we're talking about, and I'm sure the 10 barriers that Dr. Jackson is going to articulate are downstream phenomena. We need to go back upstream and say at the outset, at the intent, when you establish the hypothesis or set the drug discovery plan, at that moment in time, when you write the protocol, are you writing the protocol with an inclusive angle? I think that when we go to root cause, it's not 10, it's 1, it's culture. What's the culture of the sponsor who wants to get this done? Is it finding the most expedient way? Is it looking for the population where the answer will be the most likely positive and the greatest return on investment? Or is it an extramural funding where you go into the traditional academic medical centers to perseverate, as we do all the time, and come up with more hypotheses and more funding opportunities? We got to immerse this notion of inclusiveness. If we transition a little bit from diversity and talk about inclusivity with the predominant question, with the primary question, and deal with this upstream, these barriers that we will articulate in a moment will be much less difficult to overcome.
And now, Quita, as someone who has been a champion for this from the industry standpoint,
Yes.
I'd love to hear a bit about the barriers from your perspective and how we overcome them.
So a couple of things. I think Dr. Yancey is right on the money. One of the things that we most recently did, we put out our 2025 commitments on our website, and in that space, we're asking all of our molecule teams to have inclusive research plans from the beginning, because to his point, you have to be thinking about this from the very start. And so we've been working on advancing inclusive research since 2017 at Genentech to really think about what are the diseases that we're studying, where are the sites that we're going. But there's some fake news out here that we need to dispel. Fake news says patients of color don't want to participate in clinical research. Well, I can tell you that's fake. We just did a study called Impacta, where we were looking at COVID-19 pneumonia. We had over 380 patients in the study. 85% of the patient population were from communities of color: Hispanic, the Navajo Nation, Black. We went to Brazil. We went to Africa, and not South Africa, but Sub-Sahara Africa. We went to Mexico. So the patients are out there, and they're willing to participate if you ask them. But we also have to think about the reward system a little bit differently. Most of the times we're rewarding the company people and sites on first patient in. When we did Impacta, we went to other sites. So instead of going to, say, Stanford in San Francisco, we went to Oakland, we went to Howard, we were in Detroit. And you know what? And some of those sites we had never used before. And maybe it did take 1 or 2, 3 days longer to get the IRB up and running. But at the end of the day, we had a bigger pool of patients to choose from. And so site selection is really critical in thinking about where are people living. Zip codes can routinely determine your health.
Thank you so much, Quita. That is really expansive in terms of all of the different places you were able to reach and all of the different, people from those places. I'm wondering, in terms of, you had brought up, rewards at one point. Should there be rewards given? Should there be penalties done when it comes to researchers or specific studies or specific industry partners when it comes to whether or not they're able to successfully recruit from diverse populations? Should there be some kind of way to enforce looking for success in that? I'm curious if anyone has any kind of thoughts on how this should be, I guess, regulated.
So I'm happy to speak up first. There is guidance released as recently as the fall of 2020 from the FDA arguing for more diversity in clinical trials. And again, I'm using a broad brushstroke when I say diversity. But the qualifying language on the FDA statement, non-binding. So the language is just that, it's language. There are no consequences. It's guidance as it intends to be. It's direction, but it's non-binding. And so this carrot stick friction is important to dive into, because one has to wonder, what's the greater good here? How much do we accomplish when it's a stick and we force these sorts of things, if there's a way to do that, versus using the market, using advocacy, using awareness to find a different approach. And there are ways that this can be done without it being onerous or painful. I mean, for example, if there is an entity, a corporate entity in particular, that really makes a good faith effort and recruits a diverse population, why not extend the patent protection? Why not? If there is a federal contract, NIH sponsored, and a particular site does a very good job with diversity, why not augment the indirect costs to go back to the institution? Now we're talking about incentives that people will recognize and will work harder. I mean, if we sit back and make this less a binary question of do we support underrepresented groups or not, and make it a more intellectual question, how do we approach this differently? Then I think we have an opportunity to be uniquely different than we've ever been before.
I gotta say, I'm not entirely sure that I agree that incentives are what we need. Maybe just a clarification of the natural market forces of getting this right. So, I think for me personally, I don't think of this as a separate question. How do we do good science that is inclusive, or how do we do good science that's diverse or representative? The question is, how do we do good science? And good science is inclusive. Good science is representative from the very beginning. We've seen, clear examples from both Clyde and Quita of how rewarding it is to get this right. You get more participants, your trials enroll faster, You have a broader reach. You have like a bigger pool to draw from. So, some incentives are great, but, we don't incentivize necessarily having the right statistical test. We don't necessarily incentivize, having a thoughtful data safety and monitoring plan. We just expect those things to be done. And when they're not done, there are consequences, there are punishments, but most importantly, you kind of lose the respect of your peers, you lose that market edge. And I think the quicker we kind of clarify that there is a market opportunity here, the less that we need those incentives. So Genentech, Quita can speak to this for days, they're getting this right. They're finding opportunities that no one else is in, and they've been doing it for years. So it's less about, creating new incentives and more about now everybody's got to catch up to Genentech. Because the first major companies in every sector to get this right, they're going to be leaders for years, if not decades. We're building, these engines of precision medicine. And if we can build our genotypic and phenotypic databases to be diverse, who's going to be licensing those if they're representative? Like, you're going to be first in line. So there are plenty of incentives, around. I don't think we need to build in new ones.
I would agree. I think this is a business imperative for organizations. I mean, when we look at the vaccine manufacturers, they were very clear on engaging communities of color in those studies, because they realized that in order for people to want to take the products, you've got to have safety and efficacy. And so I do think that, our industry, whether it's pharma, whether it's the FDA, is saying to us that we want to see commitment to enhance participation in clinical research. And there are those of us that are stepping up to get it done.
We are talking about external forces that are changing the dynamic. We are talking about the scientific opportunities, Dr. Jackson. I agree with you that if you're developing a product that's unique for a certain patient population, you should enrich your trial. That's the population you should study. If there is a business imperative, as Quita Highsmith says, absolutely take advantage of that business imperative. And when there is a public health imperative, which we just faced, it is disingenuous to not be representative in those cases. Those are the high bar examples, and I think that's great. But we have to think about a system that will promulgate through all of the other clinical trials that are being done, because this is an argument that is tiresome. Every time there's a new therapeutic, we have to revisit, we have to look at the subgroups, and we have to have the same responses about what we tried. Nonsense. If you tried the same thing that's failed many, many times over, guess what? It's going to fail again. You need to try a different approach. And they need to be either need to be nudged or forced to try a different approach. I would love it if science was the only driver, because, like Jonathan, I'm a scientist. And so I would love that we could just study the academic scientific question. But there's a point in this equation where something else happens. And so we've talked about several things. We've talked about barriers, we've talked about culture, we've talked about business, but we should not let this part of the conversation rest until we talk about leadership.
Yes.
Because it's got to be a commitment from leadership in the corporate suite, leadership in the academic institution, leadership of the clinical trial. Teams follow the pace set by leaders. And if leaders don't change, then we keep executing as we have before.
Thank you so much, Clyde. Quita, I have a question for you. So, we were just watching the COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials, and that was done with, may I say, an unprecedented amount of transparency to really show the public, to help them understand the process of development. I'm wondering, are there lessons that can be learned for the rest of, industry from the COVID-19 clinical trials that we saw?
Absolutely. First of all, you've got to go where the patients are. One of the things that we learned in our impacts study is you've got to be in the community. The hospital that people are driving by in their neighborhood, that's the hospital they trust. They don't trust having to go across town to the big academic institutions. So we have to be in the neighborhood. That's important. The other thing is, we have to think broader than the same old tried and true places that we used to go to. That is kind of been a taboo. And we dispelled that myth that you can go to new places, build some foundations. We're actually right now starting up on what we call Advancing Inclusive Research Site Alliance, where we're going to be working specifically with sites in communities of color in Alabama, in Texas, in Tennessee, in LA, so that we can broaden who has access. And then we have to work on our processes, and we have to look at our inclusion exclusion criteria, because so many times the inclusion exclusion criteria is based on a white male from 20 years ago. And we need to be thinking about it differently, thinking about body mass index, thinking about creatinine clearance, thinking about things that might be normal for people of color that would exclude them from the clinical trial for no real scientific or valid reason. And so there are a lot of things that can be done. But the number one thing that I want to impart is we must not blame the patients. So, so many times I hear, well, they don't want to participate because of Tuskegee, because of Henrietta Lacks. Like, we need to stop that. We need to stop that. What we need to do is educate people so they understand the value of clinical research, and then they will come, because that's what we did in Impacta, and I know that it works.
So since we have the opportunity to have a discussion at the panel level, let me gently offer a different perspective. We should recognize that it's only been within the last decade that the final descendant of the Tuskegee experiment, i.e. the spouse of one of the men in that experiment, expired. So there are people with active recall of the consequences of the Tuskegee experiment. And for someone like my peers that's been in clinical trials for a long time, the issue comes up and it requires comment. It breeds mistrust. One of the 10 barriers that Dr. Jackson's already put in the chat, I think number 3 was this issue of trust. And so it's got to be overcome. I currently sit on the Lacks Foundation. We raise philanthropic funds to support the descendants of Henrietta Lacks. And previously, I was chair of the Lacks, the HeLa-Cell task force with the NIH, overseeing the correct use of this precious resource. And it had not been used in an ideal way prior to this task force. So these legacy experiences, and I can go through a litany of others, do breed this trust and mistrust dynamic. But to Quita Highsmith's point, think about whom it is that articulates what you just said, Quita. Whom is it that comes back and says, this patient didn't want to sign the consent, they had a lot of questions, they won't cooperate. It almost always is someone that has a cultural perspective that is dissonant from the patient being described. It doesn't have to be same, but it has to be someone that appreciates the cultural experience of the patient participating. Everyone likes just a little bit of respect. And if you don't feel it, the pushback is always palpable.
Now, we have a number of reader questions here. It's a very lively Q&A. The first one I want to start off with, and this is actually a question that I get asked a good amount whenever I'm reporting on this, normally in the comment section. Sage Gustafond asks, race is socially constructed and an inaccurate and misleading proxy for biological factors. How can we more clearly discuss the scientific value of racially diverse clinical trials without perpetuating the myth of biological race? I'd love to point that one at you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I've actually got a paper coming out about this later this year. So I'll just give you the quick highlights. So there are 3 points in particular. So for those of you who are taking notes, here we go. So first of all, if you are thinking about using race in your studies, don't. Because what you are likely conflating is race with racism. So if you're going to be using a race as a construct, it may be potentially useful for dimension reduction, but it is not sufficient. That's not a reason to include it. I think for those who don't measure race and just kind of include it, it's often seen as some issue of external validity or generalization, but it actually has knock-on effects and has consequences that are a little bit more germane towards dimensions of internal validity and statistical conclusion validity, which are never considered when we talk about race. So if you're thinking about including race as a variable, you have to consider that there are massive political consequences. It is never neutral and it is never scientific. to include this variable in our studies. We do it anyway because it's convenient, not because it is scientifically valid or rigorous. It changes with almost every census here in the United States. It does not generalize beyond the United States in most consequences. It's a really bad proxy of what we think of as different kinds of discrimination and racism. And it obscures and masks true variability, which means if we're using it in our models, we're worsening our models by leaning on this variable. So it has less to do with skin color and cultural practices than rather whether people have been a target of systemic racism. So we should be measuring that instead of what people call themselves. And it tends to be used in the wrong way. So you have very well-meaning scientists who want to try to understand how race is impacting these kinds of variables, but it inadvertently centers and normalizes whiteness, as well as English speakingness, frankly, for that matter, and it normalizes wealth and excessive education. Now, there are lots of other issues. I'm gonna stop there because I know that Queen and Clyde have thoughts too, but we need to get rid of this, and not just in terms of using race, but certainly using whites as our referent group. We know that phase 3 for the Pfizer COVID trials, they used whites as the referent group in a global study, which makes zero sense. We've got to stop this practice. You can't claim that you have diversity in your studies when whites are a global minority.
So I have to jump in and applaud Dr. Jackson, but also add that if you look JAMA 2021, there is an article for which I'm co-author along with Neil Poe at UCSF and with Dr. Ioannidis at Stanford. And it's recalibrating the use of race in medical research. And exactly to Dr. Jackson's point, the only space where we allow the use of race, if your intention is to further elucidate evidence of healthcare disparities. And we make explicit reference to the fact that race is not a surrogate for biology, and it's not even a surrogate for the social construct. Race is a surrogate for racism. That's a pause moment. There are ways that we can measure the social construct if that's what you want to measure. Area deprivation index, social vulnerability index. We have more sophisticated tools now. We know characteristics of communities. We have geospatial coding. We can understand the life and living circumstances better than before. But to infer that there is something uniquely different as a function of race and imply that it's biologic is a miss. That is ill-advised. But if you're trying to elucidate ongoing disparities, then it's appropriate. But it's January, JAMA 2021. I would encourage you to write it, to read it. If you can't get it, I'll send you a PDF.
And I think both of those points are true. And one of the challenges for clinical research is equitable access. Who has access? And we know historically marginalized people in this country don't have access to clinical research, right? And so I don't think people think race is a construct for science, but we have to be thinking about who has access and who gets asked to participate.
So Eileen McCormick asks, the NIH formally recognized in 2016 as the year of diversity on clinical trials. There was an attempt to raise awareness and solutions around the issue. Some companies, some of big pharma made very large efforts, investments, infrastructure to address that issue. Why have we seen seemingly very little progress in terms of tangible solutions? And why do we think now, this time, is different?
I mean, I can start with addressing that. First of all, this is a systemic problem in this country. So there is no overnight solution that is going to take place. What I do know is that when you are focused on finding some solutions, then you can do that. Just like, we were focused to ensure that we had a cohort of patients in the IMPACTA study that were representative of the people who were getting the disease. We know that we're making investments in our site alliance so that we can go into communities where traditionally there has not been research. And so I think that the investments that companies are making are going to pay off. But I don't think there is an overnight solution that is going to magically make diversity and inclusion front and center. But I do think there is progress. And what we are looking for is not perfection. We are looking for progress.
Thank you. Kelly Anderson asks, what role does structural racism in the healthcare system play in the lack of clinical trial diversity?
So that's a powerful question. It looks like Dr. Jackson wants to jump all over it. So I'll let him go first and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, this is actually where I want to shout out one of the research fellows in my center. Her name is Paris Adkins Jackson, but don't call her Paris, call her AJ. She is all over this in a number of ways. So she's looking at this in Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease and other neurological studies. She's looking at this with COVID-19. And it is a powerful construct that may have a really complex interaction with participation in clinical research studies. So it may impact health help-seeking behavior. It may impact trust, which we know, but it also may impact other aspects of clinical trial design that are much more familiar to trialists and scientists. It may impact the way that we measure these constructs. So not just a measurement error in that it is miscalibrated for certain populations, but that the tool that we use to measure a particular thing, let's talk about pain management, for example, may be utterly inappropriate for certain contexts. It's going to, systemic racism is going to affect our selection. It's going to affect our implementation. It's going to reinforce already existing social inequities. And I think the most egregious problem of all is that it's going to flatten all of these things into the name of some sort of essentialized biological disparity. So we're going to say, oh, the problem's not us. The problem is not necessarily that we have gotten something wrong, that we've measured or that we've selected or that we've implemented in it incorrectly. We're going to say that the problem is you. Because you've got more melanin in your skin, therefore you don't feel pain. Because you have more melanin in your skin, therefore you have a different relationship between this biomarker and this disease. It's simply not the case. And that the impact and the role of systemic discrimination, systemic racism more specifically, can't be overstated. It touches every aspect of our research workflow.
We have another reader question here. Antonio Nakasato asks, is there any evidence that a more diverse clinical staff is more likely to increase enrollment of more diverse patient population?
Well, I'll jump in. I think Dr. Yancey kind of spoke to this a bit earlier about, who's asking the potential patient to participate in the research. And the answer is if someone looks like you and sounds like you, you have a higher comfort level, which is why we're doing our site alliance, so we can go into the community and engage community folks. The other thing that I think we have to rethink when we think about, what are we going to do differently? We have to rethink how do patients get asked? Is it only by the investigator? Because, we have to change the dynamic around. It shouldn't be just Dr. Yancey saying, Mrs. Jones, do you want to participate in this clinical research? There should be a different way, a more comprehensive way to understand who has the disease and then reach out to them to say, Mrs. Jones, are you interested in participating? So it is just not on the back of the investigator, who often may not ask the right Mrs. Jones and may assume some things about her that don't exist and her ability to participate.
So Nick, these two questions actually intersect quite well, because in today's world, the term or the phrase structural racism is a trigger phrase and people push back hard. But you have to understand, we're not impugning an individual as being racist. We're saying that the construct of systems is such that it advantages one group and disadvantages another group. Case in point is precisely what Quita Highsmith just referenced. Who gets trained to be a trial coordinator? Who gets trained to seek consent forms? Who reviews the protocol? All of these things reflect a structure, a process, the way an IRB functions, the way protocols are disseminated, the way studies are funded, the way investigators are rewarded, particularly with academic credit. All of this is within a fairly strict system. And that system, by design, whether it was overt or not, excludes certain important constituencies. And so when we talk about structural racism, we're saying that there's something inherent in the design of our systems, whereby the execution of that process, unfortunately, leaves some people out of the equation. And so we shouldn't fear the phrase structural racism. We should recognize it as an invitation to reevaluate our processes and understand, have we developed processes that are more inclusive?
Wow. Yeah, those are excellent responses. I wanted to address a question that Matilde Maciera Kaufman asks. She asks, how can technology help support diversity within clinical trials? What types of technology are we missing? And I'd like to add on to her question. What role do decentralized clinical trials, what play in increasing diversity? How should those be done with diversity in the forefront? And I will pose that question to Jonathan to begin.
Yeah, so I'm going to take this in a slightly weird direction. So
Mhm.
I'll leave it to Clyde and Quita to bring us back on track. So when I talk about decentralized trials in my talks, that's just sort of for polite society. When I'm among my friends, I talk about decolonized clinic, the decolonization of clinical trials, which means it's not as radical as it sounds. It just means being thoughtful about some of the things that Clyde just mentioned. So who gets to design the research question? Who gets to benefit from it? Who gets to own the data? If we open these things up, then we stand a chance of doing some of the things that we're hoping to achieve with technological advances and with decentralized clinical trials. But we do it in such a way that other stakeholder groups stand to benefit. Other stakeholder groups may be empowered. And so, there are ways of doing this. We have seen really great examples of advancing something that is either decolonized or decentralized. Thinking about the examples of the Alaska Native and American Indian tribes out west, and they're really great, say, community IRB. So instead of leaving it up to institutions or private industry, the communities themselves determine the terms of engagement with a research study. They also have really great new models for data ownership. And so, in such that researchers and research teams and even industry partners, they don't own the data, they rent it from the community. They pay them access fees. And so the community gets to basically grant data, management rights that are temporary to stakeholders like myself. And so I think these are the tools that are much more likely to be effective. There are, of course, technological tools, but they're likely to run into some of the same barriers that we see now. So without fundamentally revisiting the way that the system works, the way that we select and empower our stakeholders, we're likely to get fancier and fancier versions of the same old thing.
I'll defer to Quita Highsmith, but I really want to go again in the contrarian direction on this because there's an important point to be made.
The one thing I will say is I do think technology, especially artificial intelligence, has the ability to really help us think about real world data and evidence. I think we have to be careful that because there are so few inputs of people of color that we don't make the bias worsen as we drive towards the use of technology.
So to add on to that, I think the contrarian point that actually is worth discussing is that the very premise of your question, Nick, may actually widen disparities and widen the lack of diversity in clinical trials. Even though it sounds like these are clever solutions, it depends on access to broadband. It depends on time to access the services here. It depends on a certain level of sophistication with sometimes intricate platforms that are unfamiliar, that are language discordant. There are a lot of ways that technology can more deeply embed divisions between cohorts. And so where this can work is with community engagement, again, at the outset. Think about how easy this would be if you went to the community and said, what's the question that needs to be answered? We're thinking about this approach. How could we best answer this question? What would it take for you to participate?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not dreaming this up. This is the model from PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. My point is that we have some incipient data points, some incipient processes that are being developed that are much more patient participatory, patient friendly, that allow us to use the right tech, not just technology, but the right tech to reach out to communities.
I think your point there works so well with one of our next viewer questions from Jason Resendez. Jason asks, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure right now in Washington, D.C. What kind of infrastructure do we need to make equitable research possible?
So I'll jump in on this because what's really important is to think about, how do people seek their health care?
Hmm.
Different groups go to different places. Some go to federally qualified health clinics, some go to local hospitals. Some of the minority serving hospitals where we would love to enroll patients are hospitals that have significant challenges with quality improvement initiatives because they're under-resourced. Their safety net hospitals are underfunded. So if you want to think about how you fix some of this, at least, as all of us have said, you've got to go to the communities of interest. But the communities of interest have to be able to participate, meaning the facilities have to have the IT architecture, have to have the staff support, staff training, so they can be good participants, whatever good means, in a clinical trial design. So if we're thinking about at a federal level, how do we address this besides some enforcement of the FDA statutes and some carrot and stick approach from the NIH? It really is about repopulating the resources for safety net hospitals so they can set up clinical research centers. Why is there a clinical research center in downtown Chicago, downtown New York, or Manhattan, downtown Boston, and there's not clinical research centers on the south side of Chicago? That's already setting up the challenge.
I think the other thing that I will layer on here, and hi, Jason, is I think we need to ensure that payers, including Medicare, Medicaid, cover the expenses for patients with out of pocket to participate. Right now, only 16 states in the US cover Medicaid patients that are participating in life-saving clinical studies. And so that financial burden can be high for patients that have been historically marginalized. So one of the systemic things that we do need is to ensure that patients who are participating in clinical research, that there is no cost to them.
And I'll just sort of say, just very quickly, some of the infrastructure that we need isn't necessarily physical infrastructure. Sometimes we just need better guidance, better enforcement about basic reporting. So if you look at the drug trial snapshots released by FDA every year, usually 1 in 4 of these approved therapies has some sort of missing data around basic demographic information. And if you look within your own academic medical centers, it's probably even higher than that. So, first of all, I think we have to better understand the problem just by being more, I think, consistent in measuring it. And so I think some of these things will go a long way. But, I think to Clyde and Quita's points, there's a lot more that we have to build. There is no reason why clinical research needs to be largely restricted to academic medical centers that are physically, geographically, socioeconomically inaccessible. There is no reason why science can't be done at your local senior center. And so, I think that building that infrastructure is necessary, but we've also got to make sure that we're reporting the right things, that we're doing that consistently.
So again, just absolutely brilliant commentary. And we have to really hear this out because this is really a path forward. But I want to look at 2 questions that are in chat very quickly because they're so fundamentally important. The first one is about genomics. As we refine our genomic architecture, and Quita Highsmith used this phrase earlier, we have to realize that we are evolving genetic ancestry studies and genetic admixture studies so that we can obviate the importance of inferring race if what we're trying to get to is biology. And we can use referent data sets that actually capture the percent African ancestry, European ancestry. So let's set that question aside. But there's a really wonderful question here. This says, how do you know that you've accomplished a greater good? How do you know that your trial is diverse? So I go back to the vaccine trials. It was necessary that those trials were population representative, and they were. So I applaud the sponsors for actually recruiting a representative population of Blacks and Hispanics and other groups in those vaccine trials. But here is the risk you run if you only think about population representation, you ignore disease prevalence. So if there's a disease that's overrepresented in a particular cohort, this is what the FDA calls enrichment strategies. You enrich your clinical trial by over recruiting that population. And this is the benefit, and I'm getting a little bit in the weeds here as a clinical trialist, of adaptive trial design, where you have the opportunity to recalibrate how you're executing your study real time without paying a statistical fine and recalibrate the people in a trial. If we use these more sophisticated strategies, and again, I applaud Dr. Jackson for bringing this up in the beginning, let's use a scientific approach to answer a science problem.
That was fantastic, Clyde. And that was actually a question I had in my head. I've had conversations with Jonathan before about, diversity in clinical trials, yes, but talking about equity in clinical trials. And Jonathan had spoken to me about what it means to recruit equitably as well. I'd love to hear a bit more about, what you view success is when we're talking about recruiting or having diverse clinical trials.
Yeah, so very quickly, and because we're running out of time, I think success is actually pretty closely matched to what Clyde said. We sort of are now pursuing diversity at the cost of inclusion. And so those of you who have seen my talks, and there's a bunch of them on YouTube, there's like a really classic example of this in Alzheimer's disease, where we have diverse patients, but we can't really compare them because they came from completely different data sets or different groups. So what we need to do is we need to match the burden of disease. We'll have to figure out what that is for each and everything that we're studying. But we need to enrich our studies to match who's likely to get it, who's at risk for it, who's suffering from it. If we can do that, and we can do that in any particular environment, then that's success. And that's the bar that we need to clear.
I will say for me, that everybody on this Zoom right now has to call out when they do not see inclusion in these clinical studies. We have to be intentional, but we need more voices. It can't just be the few of us. So I applaud Stat for raising this topic. And then when we all get vaccinated and get out here and we're not in our house no more, we back on vacation, that we're still talking about this, because this has to be more than this one little moment. We have to make this a real movement if we're going to make change.
So I'll just give you a very pithy answer. I think the only way real change happens is that it starts with leadership and that it ends with culture. If we can get those two things accomplished, then everything else just becomes an exercise of execution. Change the composition of clinical trial leadership, change the culture of performing clinical trials, and we will reap a return that we've not seen before.
You're here.
Thank you so much. And with that last thought, I think we're about at time to wrap up this event. Thank you to our event sponsor, PRA Health Sciences, and to all of you who joined us, and especially thank you to Quita, Clyde, and Jonathan. This was, a wonderful opportunity to speak with you all about such a very important subject. And just thank you all for your important work to continue to do and create more inclusive and successful clinical trials. And to all of you out there, thanks for asking some really great questions. I know we had a bunch in the chat, so thank you guys for your enthusiasm. This will be our last STAT virtual event until June, as next month we will be hosting our STAT Health Tech Summit. It'll be virtual, of course. We hope you'll join us then. More information, including a full agenda, list of confirmed speakers, and a link to register can be found on our website. Until then, please stay safe and be well. Thank you so much again for your time.